I'm not proud of this, and I'm not fishing for absolution either. This is one of those stories you tell when the weight of it gets heavier than your pride. I'm William. I've lived long enough to accumulate a few versions of myself, and one of them is a guy who thought fire could solve a problem that started with greed and panic. The short version: I stole something I shouldn't have, realized too late that I'd left behind more evidence than I could explain away, and decided that chaos would be a better cover than honesty. Smoke and flames felt louder than my footsteps, more convincing than my excuses. At the time, it seemed almost logical. If everything was damaged, then nothing could be singled out. That was the math my fear did for me. The longer version starts with money trouble, a workplace that treated me like I was invisible, and a single bad decision that snowballed. I didn't wake up planning to commit arson. I woke up trying to survive a mess I'd already made. What scares me most now isn't the crime itself, it's how quickly I justified it to myself, how easy it was to tell myself I was in control. Once the idea lodged itself in my head, it didn't feel dramatic or cinematic. It felt bureaucratic. Like paperwork you don't want to do but know you can't avoid. I spent that day pretending to be normal, went to work, nodded at people, laughed at a joke I don't remember, while my mind ran quiet checklists in the background. I told myself I was being careful, but really I was just being obsessive. I replayed the theft over and over, cataloging every dumb little thing I might have touched, every angle a camera might have had. The building itself became part of the problem in my head. Too many corners. Too many witnesses. Too many chances for the truth to surface if things stayed exactly as they were. I didn't sketch diagrams or anything like that. This wasn't some mastermind situation. It was more like emotional preparation, convincing myself I could go through with something irreversible. I made sure I had an excuse ready if anyone asked where I'd been. I cleaned my apartment like guilt leaves fingerprints. I even remember standing in the shower longer than usual, letting the water pound my head while I practiced lying out loud, just to hear how it sounded. The scariest part was how calm I felt once I committed to the idea. Fear quieted down and turned into focus. I mistook that for confidence. Looking back, it was just my conscience stepping out of the room. There's a moment before you do something terrible where your brain offers you one last exit ramp. I remember standing there, keys in my hand, telling myself I could still walk away. Call in sick. Confess. Blame it on a misunderstanding. Anything but what I was about to do. Instead, I doubled down. I didn't think in terms of fire yet, not really. I thought in terms of distraction. Noise. Damage. Something big enough to swallow something small. That's how I framed it, like I was rearranging the scene rather than destroying it. Even now, that kind of mental gymnastics makes my stomach twist. I gathered what I thought I'd need, keeping it vague even in my own head. I didn't want to dwell on specifics because specifics make things real. I remember my hands shaking as I checked my pockets again and again, like muscle memory was trying to stop me by slowing me down. Every small delay felt loaded with meaning. What sticks with me most is how ordinary everything looked. The street outside was quiet. Someone was walking their dog. A car passed with music thumping softly through closed windows. The world didn't know what I was about to do, and it didn't care. That anonymity gave me courage I didn't deserve. I locked my door behind me and felt this strange clarity settle in. Not bravery, resignation. Once I stepped out, it felt like the night itself was carrying me forward, and I let it. By the time I got there, my heart was doing this uneven thump that felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I remember thinking that if anyone looked at me too closely, they'd know. Not what I was about to do exactly, but that something was off. Guilt has a posture. I was probably wearing it. The place itself felt different at night. Familiar, but hollowed out. Sounds echoed more than they should have. Every footstep felt amplified, like the building was keeping score. I paused more than once, pretending to check my phone just so I could steady my breathing and remind myself why I was there. Fix the problem, I kept thinking. As if that's what this was. I kept my movements small and deliberate. No rushing. Rushing leads to mistakes, or at least that's what I told myself. The irony is that the longer I was there, the more my nerves frayed. Time stretched in a way I'd never experienced before. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like invitations for something to go wrong. I became hyper-aware of everything, the hum of distant traffic, the faint smell of dust and old materials, even my own breathing. I remember thinking how strange it was that places absorb pieces of you, sweat, fingerprints, little bits of DNA, without ever asking permission. That thought should have stopped me. Instead, it made me want to erase myself from the scene entirely. That was the moment I understood there was no clean exit anymore. Whatever happened next was going to leave a mark, whether anyone ever traced it back to me or not. I wish I could say there was a single, clear moment where it all happened, but that's not how I remember it. It was more like crossing a line you don't see until it's already behind you. 1 second I was still telling myself this was controlled, contained. The next, things started moving faster than my thoughts could keep up. What I'd planned in my head unraveled almost immediately. Sounds carried farther than I expected. Light behaved differently. I realized I'd underestimated how unpredictable destruction really is. You don't direct it, you release it, and then it does whatever it wants. That realization hit me hard, right in the chest, and for a brief second I honestly thought about bolting and letting the chips fall where they may. Other people reacted sooner than I anticipated. A voice somewhere nearby. A door opening and closing. Nothing confrontational yet, but enough to send a spike of adrenaline straight through me. My senses narrowed to survival mode. Every decision became reactive instead of planned, and that's when the fear really set in. Not the abstract, I might get caught fear, but the immediate, animal kind that makes your hands clumsy and your thoughts scatter. I remember the smell most vividly. Not just one thing, but layers of it, sharp and overwhelming, instantly recognizable in a way that made my stomach turn. That was when it stopped feeling like a clever solution and started feeling like a disaster I'd personally unleashed. I told myself to stay calm. To finish what I'd started. To trust the logic that had brought me there in the first place. But deep down, something cracked. I knew, right then, that no matter how this ended, I'd crossed into a version of myself I couldn't pretend didn't exist anymore. This was the part one hadn't rehearsed in my head, because whoever really does. Plans feel solid right up until reality leans on them. Once things started going sideways, I was no longer executing a strategy. I was reacting, moment to moment, trying to look like I belonged where I absolutely did not. Someone coughed nearby. Another voice followed, confused, not yet alarmed. That gray space before panic is a strange one. People sense something's wrong but don't want to be the first to say it out loud. I used that hesitation to my advantage, keeping my head down, my body language neutral. I blended into the uncertainty, just another person trying to figure out what was going on. Inside, though, I was unraveling. My thoughts came in fragments. Too fast. Too much. This wasn't supposed to spread like this. I kept mentally bargaining. If I could just get out unnoticed, if no one got hurt, if the damage stayed reasonable, then maybe I could still live with myself. Looking back, that was denial doing overtime. There were moments where I almost drew attention to myself by overcorrecting, standing too still, avoiding eye contact a little too carefully. It's funny how trying to look innocent can make you look guilty. I had to consciously remind myself to move, to react the way a normal person would react to something unexpected and frightening. What shocked me most was how quickly responsibility slipped away in my mind. I started thinking of the situation as something that was happening, not something I'd caused. That mental distance made it easier to keep going, and that realization still bothers me more than the crime itself. Up until then, everything in my head had been selfishly framed: my risk, my mistake, my escape. That illusion shattered the second I realized other people were genuinely scared. Not confused scared. Not mildly concerned. Real fear, The kind that sharpens voices and makes movements jerky. Someone started asking questions out loud. Someone else raised their voice to get attention. I remember the sudden, sinking awareness that the story was no longer mine to control. Once other people start reacting, the narrative fractures. You can't guide it anymore. You can only try not to stand out in the wreckage. I forced myself to mirror their concern. Furrowed brow. Quick glances around. I muttered, "What's going on?" to no one in particular. It felt grotesque, performing worry I'd manufactured. Every word out of my mouth felt heavier than it should have, like it might tip something over if I said the wrong thing. There was a point where I locked eyes with someone for half a second too long. Nothing was said, but my chest tightened anyway. I couldn't tell if they saw guilt or if I was just projecting it everywhere. That's the thing about panic, it convinces you you're transparent, like your thoughts are leaking out through your skin. That was when the weight of it finally hit me. Whatever happened next, people were going to remember this night. And I would remember that I'd chosen to put them in the middle of it, all to bury something I didn't have the courage to face honestly. At some point, all I could really do was wait. That's a special kind of torture when you know you're responsible for the worst thing in the room but have to pretend you're just another bystander. My body felt wired and hollow at the same time, like I dumped all my energy into panic and there was nothing left to stabilize me. Time stopped behaving normally. I kept expecting someone to point, to shout, to grab my arm. Every raised voice felt like it might be the one, the moment where everything snapped into focus and I became the obvious villain in the story. When that didn't happen right away, the relief was almost as nauseating as the fear. I remember fixating on stupid details to stay grounded. The way a light flickered. The scuff marks on the floor. Someone's shoes tapping too fast. My brain clung to anything mundane, anything that suggested this was just another bad night, and not the defining moment of my life. But under that surface calm, guilt was starting to seep in. Not the dramatic, movie version guilt. The quiet kind that asks uncomfortable questions. What if someone gets blamed for this? What if someone gets hurt? What if this doesn't actually erase what you did? What if it just adds another layer? Those thoughts kept circling, and I had no good answers for any of them. For the first time since this all started, I felt small. Not clever. Not in control. Just small, standing in the aftermath of a choice I couldn't undo, hoping that anonymity would hold a little longer. Eventually, the focus shifted away from individuals and toward the situation itself. That's when I realized there might be a narrow window to remove myself from the center of things. Not fleeing, nothing dramatic, but the kind of slow, unremarkable exit that looks like shock rather than strategy. I waited longer than I wanted to. Leaving too early would have felt suspicious, at least in my head. Leaving too late meant risking questions I couldn't answer without my voice betraying me. I had to time it so it looked natural, like I was just another person deciding there was nothing more I could do. When I finally moved, every step felt amplified. I half expected someone to stop me, to ask for my name, to tell me to stay put. No one did. That silence followed me, heavier than any accusation. It felt wrong that I could just walk away. That the world would allow it. Outside, the air hit me differently. Cooler. Sharper. I took a breath that felt like the first real one I'd had all night, and it made my hands start shaking all over again. Adrenaline doesn't vanish when the danger passes, it looks for somewhere to go. Mine turned inward. I didn't look back. I was afraid that if I did, something would call me out, even if it was just my own conscience catching up. As I put distance between myself and the scene, a new fear crept in, not that I'd be caught immediately, but that I'd have to live with the knowledge that I'd gotten away with it. Getting home should have felt like safety, but it didn't. Every block stretched out, every shadow looked accusatory. I kept replaying the night in my head, editing it, imagining alternate endings where I'd made a different choice somewhere earlier, anywhere earlier. It was useless, but my brain wouldn't stop trying to negotiate with the past. I was hyper-aware of myself in public spaces. Sirens in the distance made my pulse spike even when they were clearly headed somewhere else. I caught my reflection in a darkened storefront window and barely recognized the guy staring back. He looked normal. That was the unsettling part. No mark on my face, no sign above my head announcing what I'd done. When I finally closed my apartment door behind me, the quiet was oppressive. The kind of silence that buzzes in your ears. I sat down without turning on a light, and just listened to my own breathing, half expecting a knock that never came. That's when the emotional whiplash hit, relief crashing straight into disgust. I tried to justify it again, out of habit. No one was hurt. It covered the original mistake. You survived. The arguments sounded thinner in the dark. Survival didn't feel like a win, it felt like a debt I didn't know how to repay. And for the first time, I wondered if getting away with it was actually the worst possible outcome. The next morning didn't bring closure. It brought a hangover without the alcohol. My body felt bruised from the inside, like I'd been clenching every muscle for hours and only just let go. I turned on the news with a mix of dread and compulsion, volume low, heart high. They talked about the incident in broad strokes. No names. No suspects. Just damage, disruption, speculation. I told myself to act normal, which is harder than it sounds when you're auditing every word that leaves your mouth. At work, people traded theories and half-jokes, the way they do when something scary brushes past but doesn't grab them. I nodded at the right times. I added a safe, vague comment that contributed nothing. Inside, I was screaming at myself to shut up. Sleep didn't help. I kept waking up at odd hours, convinced I'd missed a call or a knock. When I did sleep, it was shallow and crowded with dreams that weren't quite dreams, more like reruns with different camera angles. I'd wake up rehearsing explanations I hoped I'd never have to give, testing alibis against imaginary questions. What surprised me was how quickly the world moved on. How easy it was for everyone else to file it away as that thing that happened. Meanwhile, it lived in me, expanding to fill the quiet moments. I started to understand that consequences aren't always public or immediate. Sometimes they're private and ongoing, a low-grade fever you carry without telling anyone. As days turned into weeks, the justifications I'd built started to erode. At first, they'd been sturdy enough to lean on. It was necessary, it prevented something worse, I didn't have a choice. But repetition has a way of exposing weak spots, and every time I replayed them, they sounded a little more hollow. I noticed changes in myself that I couldn't easily explain to anyone else. I jumped at sudden noises. I avoided certain routes without consciously deciding to. I caught myself scanning rooms for exits like I was still expecting something to go wrong at any second. It was exhausting, living in a constant state of low-level alert for a threat that might never materialize. Conversations became tricky. Not because anyone suspected me, but because I did. I read subtext into harmless comments, flinched at casual mentions of responsibility or integrity. Once, someone joked about how fire cleans everything. And I laughed a beat too late, my stomach dropping out from under me. That was when I realized the secret wasn't static. It was actively shaping how I moved through the world. The worst part was the loneliness of it. I couldn't share this with anyone without detonating my life, so I carried it alone. I started to understand that hiding something this big doesn't just conceal the truth, it isolates you from everything else, too. I kept waiting for a moment of reckoning. A letter. A phone call. Some unmistakable sign that the universe was done letting me slide. But nothing arrived. And that absence started to feel like its own punishment. Instead of a confrontation, I got reminders. A smell on someone's jacket that made my chest tighten. A safety drill that sent my pulse racing. I learned how thin the line is between memory and panic. The past didn't need to announce itself, it just showed up, uninvited, and took a seat. I tried to be better, in small ways. Follow rules more carefully. Help when I could. Donate to causes that felt adjacent to the harm I'd caused. None of it balanced the scale. It all felt like I was paying interest on a debt I refused to name. And because I wouldn't name it, it kept accruing. What scared me most was the quiet realization that I could live with it. Not comfortably, not happily, but functionally. That frightened me more than the thought of getting caught. If a person can adapt to this, what else could they adapt to? What lines become easier to cross the second time? I started to see myself differently, not as someone who made a mistake, but as someone capable of justifying anything under enough pressure. That shift in self-image was subtle, but it cut deep. It took a long time before I could think about that night without trying to soften the edges. For a while, every memory came wrapped in excuses, like bubble wrap around something fragile. But eventually, I realized I was protecting myself from the wrong thing. The truth wasn't that I'd been unlucky or desperate or pushed. The truth was simpler and harder to swallow. I made a choice, and then I made another to protect it. When I finally stopped flinching from that, something shifted. Not relief, nothing that clean, but clarity. I could see how the original theft wasn't the real turning point. It was the moment afterward, when I decided my comfort mattered more than accountability. That's where things tipped. Fire wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the punctuation mark on a sentence I'd already written. I don't romanticize it anymore. There was no brilliance, no inevitability. Just fear dressed up as problem-solving. I think about the people who were pulled into that night without their consent, and I let myself sit with the discomfort of that. Not to punish myself endlessly, but to keep the lesson sharp. If there's any honesty left in me, it's this: facing what you did is quieter than denial, but it's heavier. And carrying that weight deliberately is the only way I know how to keep from dropping it on someone else again. I didn't get caught. Not in the official sense, anyway. No cuffs, no courtroom, no dramatic ending that wraps things up neatly. What I got instead was a quiet, permanent change in how I see myself. That's the part no one really warns you about. The way one night can redraw your internal map and make some places impossible to return to. If you're reading this and you're in that mental space where a bad choice feels like the only choice, hear this: escalation is a lie your fear tells you. It whispers that bigger chaos will erase smaller mistakes. It won't. It just multiplies them and ties them together so you have to carry all of it at once. Smoke doesn't hide the truth, it just makes it harder to breathe. I learned that avoiding consequences doesn't mean avoiding damage. Some damage just moves inside, where no one else can see it but you. And once it's there, it doesn't leave just because time passes. You either confront it, or you build your life around it and hope the structure holds. My advice, for whatever it's worth, is simple and brutal: stop earlier than you think you need to. Tell the truth while it's still one truth. Ask for help before your brain convinces you you're alone. I thought I was protecting myself that night. What I was really doing was teaching myself a lesson I'll be unlearning for the rest of my life.